It's starting to feel like fall. Are you ready for some cute and cozy autumn decor? Well, in today's video, I have 30 pretty amazing DIY projects and thrift flips that are not only beautiful, but they're also very affordable. In fact, some of them are totally free. So if you are ready for some major autumn inspiration, let's get started.
For the first project, you'll need 2 wood salad bowls. Glue them together using super glue or E6000, and when the glue is dry, paint the bowls with orange chalk paint or orange spray paint. When the paint is dry, apply a coat of antiquing wax, wiping off the excess. Then glue a large stick to the top center and add leaves and florist wire ringlets. This turned out even cuter than I expected, and because of the design on the top bowl, I don't think you can even tell that it's actually 2 bowls glued together. For the next project, you'll need an old alarm clock. Unscrew the back, then you'll be able to easily remove the bells, the mechanics, and the clock face. Also, remove the piece of glass. Spray paint the body of the clock orange and the bells and handle green. Then cut a new back plate for the clock out of a piece of scrap cardboard. I covered mine with a piece of scrapbook paper, attaching it with glue stick. Then I went around the inner edge of the clock with hot glue to attach the piece of cardboard. Glue a small piece of styrofoam on the inside bottom of the clock. Then attach small pieces of skewer sticks to some Dollar Tree velvet pumpkins and stick them in the styrofoam. I also cut some stems off of another little floral bush that I had and stuck those in. And then I added some Spanish moss to fill in empty spots. And as a final touch, I added a little wooden mouse that I had in my stash. And finally, reattach the bells. This cost me less than $5 total, and I think it turned out super cute. If you've watched any of my videos before, you already know that I love upcycling old lamps, partly because they're always priced so cheaply at my local thrift stores, and they're not that hard to take apart. Just look for nuts and screws to take off, and before long, the lamp will be completely disassembled. I sanded down the wood to remove the dark stain, and I glued an old lamp finial to fill the hole left in the top. I marked where a glass jar would sit in the middle of the lamp, and then hot glued fake leaves around the edges of that circle. To create a base, I traced around the jar on a piece of styrofoam and then cut out that circle and hot glued the styrofoam in the center of the lamp. Then I stuck floral stems into the side of the styrofoam. Every leaf and flower I used was from a thrifted floral arrangement that only cost me $3. I attached the glass jar to the top of the styrofoam with a good amount of hot glue. And then I happened to spot an old berry garland and decided to peel off all the remaining berries and wrap the garland around the lamp like an old vine. I hot glued some random leaves to the vine, and I even reused the ribbon from the thrift store floral arrangement. I love how this lantern turned out, and I especially love that it is completely made with repurposed thrift store items. Here is an extremely budget-friendly idea. Gather up a bunch of sticks from your yard. Then cut each stick to the length of a 12-inch ruler. Cut 2 long strips of brown ribbon and tape them to the floor, making sure that the pieces of ribbon are exactly 11 inches apart. Then begin hot gluing the ends of each stick to your ribbon. It's really quite simple. The only trick is finding as many straight sticks as possible. I was only able to use about half of all the sticks that I cut because so many of them were just too crooked. When you run out of sticks, cut off any extra ribbon at the ends and you're done. I recommend using Gorilla Hot Glue sticks to keep those sticks firmly adhered to your ribbon. This would make a really cute table runner for autumn if you can find enough sticks to make it long enough. Here is another almost completely free project. Collect a variety of leaves from your yard or neighborhood. Then, using a dry iron, press them for about 10 minutes between two pieces of paper towel. Cut up a few pieces of cardstock into triangle or flag shapes and then hot glue one leaf to each of the pieces of cardstock. Print out and glue on labels for each of the leaf types if you want. Then print out some of your favorite autumn-themed poems also on cardstock and cut them into the same triangle or flag shape. Cut a long piece of twine or rope and then fold the top of each piece of cardstock over the twine and hot glue it in place. I used a small piece of paper as a spacer to make sure that I spaced each piece of cardstock evenly over my twine. And then for added interest, I tied some acorns onto the twine in between the pieces of cardstock. This would be a fun project to do with children, and I love how simple and rustic it looks hanging over my fireplace screen. For the next project, you'll need a couple of those large wood leaves from Dollar Tree. Use it as a pattern and trace around it on some inexpensive plain cotton fabric. Cut out the leaf shape and then pin it to the back side of a large piece of old sweater fabric. Sew the two pieces together, stitching in about 1/2 inch from the edge of the leaf shape. Then trim off the excess sweater fabric, cutting as close to the stitches as possible. But don't cut through the cotton fabric. Paint your wood leaf in a coordinating color, and when the paint is dry, hot glue the sweater leaf to the wood leaf. I made a second leaf using a different old sweater. Then I took some small pieces of the sweater fabric and wrapped them around the nut part of an acorn and hot glued them in place. Trim off any excess sweater fabric and then hot glue the cap back onto the nut. Then hot glue a small strand of twine around the top of the cap so that you can tie the acorns onto the leaves. I realize these are maple leaves, but unfortunately my Dollar Tree didn't have any oak leaves, so we're just going to pretend that acorns grow on maple trees. Next, let's make a unique autumn garland. Purchase a package of small styrofoam pumpkins and mini glass containers from Dollar Tree. Use a heated foam cutter or an X-Acto knife to carve a hole in the top of each pumpkin, large enough to hold one of the glass containers. It's not necessary to paint the pumpkins, but I prefer that look. So I gave them a coat of Waverly's cashew chalk paint, and I put the sticks that came with the pumpkins back in them so that I could prop them up in a can to dry. Thread a strand of florist wire through a large darning needle and string on some beads. Then run the needle through the bottom of a foam pumpkin. I needed to use some pliers to push and pull the needle through the foam. Once you've added all the beads you want, then put a little hot glue on the bottom of your mini glass containers and insert them into the center of the foam pumpkins. Add a little hot glue and some Spanish moss around the top edge of the pumpkin. And finally, add some flowers to each of the little vases. Dress up each end of the garland. I drilled a small hole in a laser-cut wood leaf to add to one end of the garland, and I made a tassel out of some twine to add to the other end. I found that if the foam pumpkins are too close together, the garland is difficult to style, so make sure you use plenty of beads in between. For this next project, you'll need 2 Dollar Tree metal pumpkins and Rust-Oleum's Rust Effects paint, which is available from Amazon. Paint the metal pumpkins with 2 coats of the primer, and when the primer is dry, apply 2 coats of the iron paint. And when the iron paint is dry, finally spray the rust activator. Let it dry for 5 minutes and then apply a second coat of the rust activator. Next, paint a small Dollar Tree wood crate. I used a mixture of brown and black chalk paint, and when the paint was dry, I slightly distressed the box with sandpaper. Then I glued one of the metal pumpkins to either side of the crate using both hot glue and Gorilla Glue. To create wheels, I used my miter saw to slice off small wood rounds from an old spindle, but you could just purchase wood rounds. I painted both sides of the wheels with black chalk paint and lightly distressed them with sandpaper. Then I attached them to the metal pumpkin using a combination of Gorilla Glue and hot glue. Next, I hot glued a piece of styrofoam inside the crate and began adding faux flowers. Some of them came from thrift store arrangements and some of them came from Dollar Tree. I made sure that some of the flowers and vines stuck out through the jack-o'-lantern's face for added interest. To make the wood rounds look more like real wheels, I hammered in upholstery tacks into the center of each one. I also drilled a small hole on one end of the crate so I could screw in a small eye hook and attach a piece of twine for a little pull. It doesn't actually roll, but it does look cute, and I don't think anyone will guess that it's made primarily from Dollar Tree items. I think you're really going to be surprised at what I do with this old glass lampshade. I'm going to be using the Rust Finish Metal Effects Kit again. Apply 2 coats of the primer, follow that with 2 coats of the iron paint, and when the paint is dry, spray the shade with a light coat of the rust activator. Let it dry for 5 minutes, then give it a second spritzing of the rust activator. The shade will continue to rust over the next couple hours. In the meantime, glue a small piece of styrofoam into the opening of the lampshade, add a large stick to emulate a pumpkin stem, and then begin adding flowers, pumpkins, or small gourds to the styrofoam, and fill in any empty spots with Spanish moss. If you want your glass shade to look even more like a pumpkin, you could paint it with orange chalk paint instead of using the Rust Effects Kit. But I had a different idea for making use of this old glass shade. Use a spindle, base, or old candlestick and turn the glass shade into a mushroom. I've been noticing all the new decor out for autumn this year, and mushrooms or toadstools are absolutely everywhere. But I think this repurposed glass shade is as cute as any of the pricey ones I've seen. If you have a small piece of vintage fabric or needlepoint that you don't know how to use, you might consider using it to cover a styrofoam pumpkin. I just ripped off the orange burlap fabric from a Dollar Tree pumpkin and then wrapped it in my piece of needlepoint. I used a small metal spatula, also from Dollar Tree, to press the needlepoint fabric into the creases of the styrofoam. Because the fabric was stiff, I did have to cut a few slits to get it to lie flat, but I didn't need to use any glue. Then I wrapped 3 strips of burlap ribbon over the ribs of the pumpkin and just pinned them in place on the top center. To create a stem, I wrapped some pink thread around a vintage spool and glued that to the top of the pumpkin. Then I glued on a leaf and a vine to make it look even more like a real pumpkin. But I'm not done yet. Next, I glued a fake bird to the fake vine, and then I unwound some of the pink thread and glued a piece into the bird's beak. I also hot glued a few faux pearls onto the vine and onto the leaf for some additional embellishment. Although you might not have a small piece of needlepoint to use in a project like this, you could replicate this idea using a vintage embroidered hanky, doily, tablecloth, or even fabric from a special piece of clothing. Let's make a candle stand from an old tree branch. Find the center and then mark out several evenly spaced spots. To make holes for your candles, drill a hole in each spot using a 1-inch spade drill bit. Now let's update some old candles to add to our branch. Melt down a thrift store candle. It doesn't matter what color it is because you're going to add 1 orange and 1 brown crayon to the wax to give it a caramely color. Then dip each of your candles into the colored wax, lifting them out and letting the wax dry for a second or two, and then re-dipping them 2 or 3 times. Also dip the base of the candle in the wax so it will stand up straight in your drilled holes. I had plenty of the colored wax left, so I dipped a second set of candles because it was a good way to hide all of the stains on them. To dress up the plain tree branch, I cut up a fake bittersweet stem and arranged it around the candles. I think this looks so high-end, and it was such an easy and inexpensive project. The only thing I bought new was the bittersweet stem. Since this thrift store coffee grinder was missing some parts, I decided to use it to create autumn decor for my kitchen. The wood was pretty scratched up, so I gave it a couple coats of ivory chalk paint, and when the paint was dry, I distressed it a bit with some sandpaper. Next, I painted some cheap plastic gourds and pumpkins in a couple different colors of coordinating chalk paint. I replaced their plastic stems with pieces of stick and hot glued a bit of Spanish moss to the top of each pumpkin. I also hot glued some styrofoam into the coffee grinder and then attached the pumpkins and gourds to the styrofoam using pieces of skewer sticks. I filled in around the pumpkins with fake leaves and more Spanish moss. If you like this project but don't happen to have an old coffee grinder, just think about what other unique containers you could use instead. Here's another idea for making use of an unusual thrift store item. To update this wheelbarrow, I gave it 2 coats of dark brown chalk paint and then distressed it a bit with sandpaper. I printed out 2 pumpkin labels from the Graphics Fairy website and applied one to each side of the wheelbarrow using Mod Podge. To create some small pumpkins for the wheelbarrow, rub sandpaper over some small terracotta pots to make them look more aged. Then hammer a nail set through the hole to make them larger so that you can hot glue a small stick into each hole. Also, glue on some leaves and Spanish moss to the top of each terracotta pot. I put the pots in the wheelbarrow and then stuffed Excelsior all around the pots to hold them firmly in place. I only needed to hot glue one of the pots that kept falling out the back end. I had this little bonsai rake, so I stuck it in the wheelbarrow too. I'm not sure from where I picked up these little terracotta pots, but you can find several different sizes very cheaply on Amazon. Here's an idea for creating full-sized, rustic-looking terracotta pots. Mix some gardening lime with water at a 50-50 ratio. Stir until the small granules are dissolved. Then spread the lime mixture over your terracotta pots and let them dry overnight. I would recommend applying a lighter coat than you see me doing here. Once it's dry, sand off some of the lime to achieve the weathered look you like. Spray the pots with a clear matte top coat to seal the lime and keep it from further rubbing off. The empty pots can be stacked to create a cute display, or you can fill them with faux flowers and plants. I filled a medium-sized 4 to 6 inch terracotta pot with 1 faux pumpkin, 1 faux flower, and 1 dried hydrangea, and filled in around them with ivy leaves and Spanish moss. Here is a super easy way to create primitive looking candles. Melt any old candles you have on hand in a pan in an oven set to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Add a piece of crayon to your melted wax to achieve your desired color. Then spoon the wax over an existing candle. I used taper candles from Dollar Tree and the thrift store. The wax gets thick pretty quickly, so you may need to return the pan to the oven for a while. When you're done, put your dishes in the freezer for 30 minutes and the cold wax will pop right off. You can burn these like any other taper candle, but I usually just use them as decor. I like to bundle them together and tie them with a strip of cotton fabric. For this project, print out some simple leaf images on transparency film. You just insert it into your printer like a sheet of paper. Then cut the transparency to fit inside some Dollar Tree frames. Remove the glass, the back of the frame, and any pins or staples that hold them in place. Because the transparency film is so lightweight, you can just glue it onto the back side of your frame. Leave it as it is or add a nature image behind the transparency. You can also glue on a piece of twine to create a hanger. Although I used inexpensive Dollar Tree frames, I also think these transparent images would look gorgeous in a beautiful vintage frame. For the next project, you'll need a few empty soda cans. Begin by using a can opener to remove the top tab section of each can. Then use a regular pair of scissors to cut down the side of each can. You should probably wear gloves because the metal can be sharp. Then cut off both the bottom of the can and the top rim. You should be left with a rectangle of metal, which you can run along the side of a table to straighten out. To create a pattern, I taped a fake leaf to my sheet of metal and then cut around it. I used the same leaf over and over, but you could use different leaves if you prefer. To create veins in the leaves, fold each one in half and then use a small screwdriver to emboss other veins on the back of each leaf. Next, spray paint both sides of the metal leaves with some gold metallic spray paint. Once the paint is dry, hot glue the leaves to a branch from your yard. Because real branches often break when stored away, I did think about gluing the metal leaves to faux stems instead, but ultimately I just like the look of real branches better. Since I just attached the leaves with hot glue, I'll probably pop them off at the end of the season and just store the metal leaves until next year. I love nature-inspired decor for fall, so I thought I would add some natural elements to this thrift store lantern. I took a bag of Dollar Tree moss and began covering the lantern using hot glue. It adheres much easier than you might think, but it does take a minute to cover the entire lantern. Once it was completely covered, I went back and added some additional fluffy reindeer moss to cover some of the edges that were poking through. Since my lantern had a small opening at the top, I decided to hot glue a fake bird in that opening. And to suggest a nest, I also added a small bundle of angel vine and some Spanish moss. Rather than adding a traditional taper candle in the lantern, I popped off the candle base and hot glued a small wood slice in its place. Then I filled in around the wood slice with some more of that Dollar Tree moss. To give the handle a more rustic look, I wrapped it with twine, then sprayed on a little adhesive and sprinkled on just a dab of the moss. For some additional interest and a little pop of color, I twisted a strand of white pip berries up one side of the lantern. Obviously, for safety reasons, I would not be able to light a real candle in this very flammable lantern. However, I couldn't resist adding these two adorable mushroom candles on top of the wood slice. I used a heated foam cutter to cut the base off one of the mushrooms so it would be slightly shorter than the other. And then I just hot glued them in place. These little mushrooms are far too cute to burn anyway. Although my lantern was metal, this is a great way to dress up a cheap plastic lantern if you happen to see one of those at the thrift store. Although this thrift store wood plate was very pretty in its natural state, I decided to paint the inside portion with 2 coats of white chalk paint. Then I pulled out a pretty floral napkin that I had purchased at Home Goods, and I began cutting around a section of the floral design that I thought would fit nicely on the plate. When decoupaging with napkins, check to see whether you're using 2 or 3 ply napkins so that you can be sure to remove all the plain layers. Next, I applied a thin coat of glossy Mod Podge over the entire painted area of the plate. Then I carefully placed my napkin onto the Mod Podge, using my paintbrush to smooth it into place and brush out any wrinkles. One section of leaves folded and tore when I tried to straighten it out, so I just carefully scraped it off and cut those same leaves from a different section of the napkin, and then lined up the new piece with the existing pattern. I also cut another small section from my napkin to fill in a blank area of the design. Then I went over the entire napkin with another coat of Mod Podge. In all, I applied 3 additional coats of the glossy Mod Podge to seal and protect the design. A decoupaged plate like this is primarily for decor. Although you can use it for food, it is recommended that you place a piece of wax paper under the food so you don't risk damaging your artwork. I love topiaries and was hoping I could turn this sad-looking one from the thrift store into something special for autumn. The first task was to remove all of the dusty and cheap-looking ivy from the metal orb. It took a minute, but it was well worth the effort. At the same Goodwill where I found the metal orb, I also found an oversized candle stand, and I wanted to join them together. But first, I needed to unite the color of the 2 pieces. I decided to try staining the candle stand with antiquing wax. I wasn't sure if this would work, but I thought it was worth a try. I brushed the wax on and let it sit for a few minutes before dabbing away the excess. I was really pleased with the outcome, and this was so much easier than painting. To attach the orb, I needed to remove one of the metal prongs at the bottom. This can easily be done with a jigsaw, reciprocating saw, or angle grinder. Next, I popped out the metal candle cup from the top of the candle stand and drilled a hole in the center using a drill bit the same size as the orb's remaining prong. I added a bit of Gorilla Glue in the hole and then inserted the orb's prong into the hole. I needed to tap it into place a few times with a hammer because it was a snug fit. I had recently picked up a fall garland at Goodwill, and at the time I thought that I would remove the gourds and use them on their own, but I decided I would wrap it around the orb just to see how it looked, and I actually really liked it. Most of the vines were stretched out, so I twisted them around a dowel rod to make them look like little ringlets. And then to add some additional texture and color, I cut up some stems covered in little red seeds and used some florist wire to wrap them over some of the brown vines. To give the illusion that the vines were growing from the center, I hot glued some Spanish moss in the bottom middle of the orb. For a finishing touch, I found a little bird in my stash and hot glued him to a leaf near the top of the orb and glued a couple of those little red seeds in its beak. This is definitely not your typical topiary. In fact, I'm not sure it even qualifies as a topiary, but I like that it's so unique. And I especially like that it cost me less than $12 to make. At a thrift store recently, I saw an entire tub full of skeins of crochet thread or string for only 50 cents each. The small orange one really caught my eye, and I thought they might just make cute pumpkins. The cardboard spool in the middle was closed on one end but open on the other. So I filled the spool full of small pieces of styrofoam. To create a stem, I used a piece of tree branch and inserted it into the styrofoam. To create ribs for the largest ball of string, I added 4 strands of jute, pulling it across the ball of string and then gluing both ends of each strand inside the spool opening. Since this spool was larger, I first hot glued a long stick inside the spool, and then I added a plastic bag before filling in the rest with styrofoam. I added some leaves and then began hot gluing some Spanish moss around the sticks. For additional embellishments, I just pulled pip berries and flowers from old thrift store floral arrangements. I also found a little owl in my stash and glued him to the top of one of the balls of string. And I glued a Dollar Tree butterfly sticker to the orange pumpkin. I think the soft texture of the crochet thread creates a charming and rustic-looking pumpkin that is just perfect for fall. Plus, you can easily create pumpkins in a variety of sizes and colors. I picked up a rusty kerosene lamp at Goodwill for under $3, which I thought was a steal. And I knew right away that I wanted to put a small pumpkin or two in the middle. To hold everything in place, I cut up a moss-covered styrofoam ball and hot glued the pieces around the pumpkin. Since there was only room for one pumpkin, I added some fall florals to fill in around the pumpkin. These were all pulled from old thrift store arrangements. To add some additional interest to the brown vines, I tore some small leaves off of another faux stem and hot glued them in random spots to the vine. Once I was happy with the arrangement, I hot glued some additional reindeer moss and Spanish moss over the styrofoam pieces. I dabbed some brown chalk paint on the vine to conceal a few spots where the white paper was showing through. This is another example of how you can use a cheap and unexpected thrift store piece to create something unique for fall that looks like you spent a lot of money at a high-end store. Here's an idea for dressing up those grapevine balls that often come in a bag of potpourri. This one was looking especially sad, so I decided to cover it with some free acorn caps from my yard. If you don't have an oak tree, I can almost promise you that your neighbors will be more than happy if you pick up the acorns from their yard. First, I cut the stems from the caps and then just began hot gluing them to the grapevine ball and gluing the sides of the caps together whenever possible. Once the ball was completely covered, I took little bits of moss and hot glued them in the gaps between the caps. Since I wanted to be able to hang this ball, I created a large loop with a strand of Dollar Tree burlap ribbon and hot glued the ends into a gap between the acorn caps. And of course, I had to add a bow to dress it up a bit. This was such a fun, easy, and inexpensive project. Now I'm wondering, what else could we use to cover old grapevine balls? To create some autumn-themed wall art, I first primed 2 plastic picture frames. Then I painted them with black chalk paint mixed with a little salt wash, which gives the paint some texture and helps it to adhere to the plastic. You know I love just about any kind of bird art, and blackbird prints seemed like a great choice for fall. So I downloaded 2 high-resolution crow images from the Audubon Society website and printed them out to fit inside my oval frames. I had a flat plastic bird in my stash that I had previously thrifted. I painted it black to match and glued it to one of the frames with Gorilla Glue. Then for extra durability, I filled the gap between the bird and frame with some super glue. I think I've always been attracted to the dark, moody vibes of Halloween decor, but I don't care for skeletons or spiders in my home. But now, blackbirds, that's a different story. I bought a ceramic owl at the thrift store that was already very nice, but I wanted to make it really stand out. To create a pedestal for the owl, I decided to combine 2 old candlesticks from my stash. First, I sanded the areas where the 2 would be glued together, and then I used Gorilla Glue and a little hot glue to adhere them together. Next, I sprayed the pedestal with a coat of Zinsser primer, and when the primer was dry, I brushed on a coat of black chalk paint mixed with a little salt wash. I also used this paint to paint over the ceramic owl. I used Gorilla Glue to attach the owl to the top of the pedestal. Then I filled in the seam with some caulk. This unifies the 2 pieces and adds stability to the connection. I let the caulk dry for about 30 minutes and then I painted over it. To add dimension to the matte black paint, I applied a heavy coat of antiquing wax to the entire piece and then lightly dabbed away the excess. However, it was still looking too flat in my opinion. So I pulled out some gold wax and just lightly brushed it on to add some highlights. But I thought I added a little too much of the gold wax. So I applied yet another coat of antiquing wax to tone down the gold. And finally, perfection. Had I placed the original owl on the bookshelf, it would have just blended in with the books. But attached to a pedestal, it adds height to this corner and really demands your attention. Here's another idea for upgrading cheap candles or reviving old stained ones. Separate the plies of a decorative napkin. Set aside the top patterned ply and cut it to fit around your candle. Turn your iron to a medium-low heat setting. Then roll your napkin-covered candle over the sole plate of your iron. Be careful not to let your fingers or the candle itself come in direct contact with the sole plate. Trim off any extra napkin at the top and bottom of the candle, and then run that edge over the sole plate to seal the edges. This is such an easy and inexpensive way to revamp old candles and customize them for the season. I find beautiful napkins at HomeGoods and on Amazon. If you want to check them out, I have some of my favorites linked in my Amazon store. For this next project, I wanted to see if I could make plaster leaves. I stirred water and plaster of Paris together until I reached a pancake batter-like consistency. Then I began dipping fake leaves into the mixture and laying them on an old cardboard box to dry. Avoid using red leaves because I discovered the red dye bleeds through the plaster. I also discovered, surprisingly, that the plaster adheres better to plastic leaves than it does silk ones. Once the leaves were dry, I painted over them with ivory chalk paint mixed with just a little plaster of Paris. This filled in any cracks or spots where you could see the fake leaf showing through. When the paint was dry, I tied the leaves to a piece of twine to create a garland, adding some beads and a wood slice in between each leaf. When I first did this project, several viewers suggested mixing PVC glue or white glue into the plaster mixture, which is a great idea. I definitely think that would make the plaster leaves more resilient so that they would stay looking nice for several seasons. In this next project, I wanted to see if I could make a cheap thrift store plastic pumpkin look like a vintage rusty metal one instead. My pumpkin had screw holes, which I filled with some caulk. And when the caulk was dry, I lightly sanded it smooth. Then I painted it with the rust finish metal effects that you saw me use in 2 previous projects. While the primer was drying, I painted over the facial features and the stem with just regular black chalk paint. Then I applied 2 coats of the iron paint, followed by 2 coats of the rust activator spray. The pumpkin continued to rust for several hours, and I absolutely love how it turned out. Even up close, you would never guess that this is a $3 plastic pumpkin from Goodwill. This next project is not an original idea. It's something I saw on Pinterest that I just had to try out for myself. I cut the handles off of a plastic pumpkin pail and covered the holes with a couple pieces of duct tape. Then I used a Dollar Tree strainer to remove some of the rocks from a bag of quick-set concrete. If you want a more rustic look, then just skip this step and leave all the rocks in the mix. I added water and stirred it up until I reached a consistency similar to brownie batter. I sprayed the inside of the plastic pumpkin with a good amount of nonstick spray, and then I poured in the concrete mix. Next, I filled a disposable plastic cup with rocks and sprayed it with the nonstick spray. Then I placed it inside the pumpkin. This causes a lot of spillage, so you'll want to have a rag nearby. I let the concrete dry for 24 hours. Then I used a utility knife to cut a slit in the cup and pull it out from the concrete. It actually came out much easier than I was expecting. To remove the plastic pumpkin from the concrete, I made sure that I ran my utility knife only along the ridges in the pumpkin and around the base of the pumpkin so that any marks that I made would not be noticeable in the concrete. Once again, the plastic easily popped off the concrete. I used an old rag to wipe down the concrete pumpkin and a little sandpaper to sand out the knife marks and the ridges. Due to the large hole that we made in the top by adding the cup, there are so many possibilities for decorating this concrete pumpkin. Although I staged it with candles and faux plants and flowers, there is room to add a live plant, and I think a small chrysanthemum would look adorable. I hope you'll let me know which of today's projects you want to try. Thank you so much for watching. And if you'd like to see even more affordable fall decor ideas, here's another video I think you'll like.